Please, God, make me famous. You can do anything you want to me. Just make me famous.
When Matthew Perry died, he left behind not just millions of mourners, but an unclaimed empire, $120 million, and a flowing river of wealth. He had no wife, no kids. Hollywood's biggest question was, what would happen to this colossal fortune? On October 28, 2023, the world lost its best friend. This wasn't just the loss of an actor. It was the farewell of a safe harbor millions had sought in their toughest times. The farewell of Chandler Bing. But before the warmth of grief could cool, a cold and sharp question seeped into the headlines. Who would inherit? This question was far more than simple curiosity, because Perry's fortune wasn't just a bank account. It was a self-renewing, perpetually working money machine. The estimated $20 million in annual residual income from the show, Friends, that continued to flow into Perry's account, turned this inheritance from a mere treasure into a kingdom. This made the pie at stake mind-bogglingly valuable, and everyone was counting down the days for what was expected to be one of Hollywood's bloodiest inheritance battles to begin. Inheritance hunters, the tabloid press, and long-forgotten old friends all saw an opportunity in this tragedy. An unclaimed kingdom was waiting to be seized. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The bloody war everyone was expecting never started, because Perry had seen this game before anyone else and had made his final move years ago. What no one knew was that 14 years before his death, Matthew Perry, like a forward-thinking chess master, had prepared a bombshell that would end this war before it even began. The will he prepared was not just a plan to distribute wealth. It was designed to protect a deadly secret hidden behind walls. That deadly secret wasn't hidden in a bank vault or a coded document. The first clues were cemented into the very empire Matthew Perry built for himself, a kingdom of glass and steel meticulously designed to keep the world out. The secret was hidden behind the walls of his spectacular, multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. To understand the sheer scale of this empire, you have to start at its peak, 40 stories above the Los Angeles skyline. The crown jewel was his mansion in the sky, a colossal penthouse that consumed the entire 40th floor of the ultra-exclusive The Century building. This wasn't just an apartment, it was a fortress. In 2017, Perry acquired it for a staggering $20 million. 4 years later, he sold it for $21.6 million to pop superstar Rihanna, a testament to the property's iconic status. But his kingdom wasn't confined to the clouds. It stretched to the sandy shores of Malibu, where he owned an iconic oceanfront beach house. He bought it for $12 million in 2011 and sold it a decade later for $13.1 million. These weren't just homes, they were trophies, physical proof of the $120 million empire he commanded. They screamed success, power, and untouchable fame. But here's where the plot thickens. While the world saw a king in his castle, those closest to him saw something else entirely, a prisoner. Behind stunning views and designer interiors was a crushing, deafening silence. These massive, empty spaces weren't a home, they were a golden cage. Friends and sources repeatedly confirmed that in his final years, Perry was very lonely. Imagine the irony. The man who brought laughter into millions of living rooms couldn't find joy in his own. Those vast, empty corridors didn't echo with happiness, they amplified his solitude. That strong, funny man who was a friend to the world was in fact desperately helpless and isolated within his own four walls. This deep, emotional battle forced him to make a drastic decision. He began to dismantle his own kingdom. He sold off the greatest symbols of his wealth, liquidating nearly $35 million in prime real estate. This was his great escape. In 2020, he retreated from the overwhelming scale of his life and purchased a more modest $6 million cottage in the quiet neighborhood of Pacific Palisades. From the outside, it looked like a man finally choosing peace over prestige, simplicity over splendor. He was trading his throne in the sky for a sanctuary on the ground. He thought he was running toward safety, but he was running directly into a trap. That final sanctuary, that peaceful cottage in Pacific Palisades, would become the epicenter of the mystery that sealed his fate. It was far more than just the place where he tragically died. The walls of that very house held the key to how and why he died. If Matthew's story is resonating with you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps share the true story behind the legend. The key to the mystery hidden within the walls of that Pacific Palisades cottage wasn't a ghost or a hidden document. It was the man who lived inside them. Matthew Perry had escaped the empty vastness of his mansions, but he could never escape himself. The world knew him as Chandler Bing, the witty, lovable friend who always had the perfect sarcastic remark. But that was a character, a mask he wore for the cameras. Behind that mask was Matthew Perry, a man fighting a relentless, lifelong war against addiction. This was the brutal contradiction at the core of his existence. He lived in a golden cage, a prisoner of his own success. The $120 million empire he commanded, the fame that made him one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, couldn't buy him the one thing he craved: peace. For Perry, money wasn't a ticket to luxury. It was a war chest. It was the fuel he needed to finance his desperate, unending battle just to stay alive. And the cost of that war was staggering. It's a figure that puts his entire fortune into a chilling new perspective. In his own memoir, Perry made a jaw-dropping confession. He had spent an estimated $9 million in his lifetime trying to get sober. Let that sink in. Not on yachts, not on private jets, but on survival. That number wasn't just a financial statistic, it was the price tag of his pain. It represented decades of agony, countless failed attempts, and, most tellingly, 15 separate stints in rehab. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. The pressure of fame fueled his addiction, and the money from that fame funded the fight against it. He was a man with all the resources in the world, yet he was utterly powerless against the demons that had moved into his new quiet home with him. But in the midst of this darkness, as he fought for his own life, Perry became obsessed with an idea that would redefine his entire purpose. He grew terrified that his legacy would be nothing more than the character he played on TV. This became a powerful emotional driver, a new battle to fight. He wasn't just fighting to live anymore, he was fighting to be remembered for something more. He said it himself in one of his most poignant interviews. "When I die, I don't want friends to be the first thing that's mentioned. I would like it if the things I did to help other people were listed far ahead of friends." This wasn't just a fleeting wish. It was his new mission statement. It was the blueprint for the legacy he was determined to build, a way to turn his immense pain into a source of hope for others who were fighting the same war. This was his ultimate dream, for his fortune to become a force for good. But in a tragic twist of fate he could never have predicted, the very foundation that would be created after his death to fulfill this dream would also become the key to unlocking the dark and disturbing secrets of his final hours. The key to unlocking the secrets of Matthew Perry's final hours would ultimately be found in the aftermath of his death. But first, the world needed to understand the tragedy of his final day. On the surface, October 28, 2023, was disarmingly ordinary. Perry spent the morning doing something he had grown to love, playing pickleball with friends. It was a routine part of his new, quieter life in Pacific Palisades. After the game, he returned home and sent his assistant out on a few errands. It was the last time anyone would see him alive. A few hours later, the assistant returned to a silent house and made a devastating discovery. Perry was unresponsive in his jacuzzi. The initial shock gave way to a storm of speculation.
But soon, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office released its official report, a document that was supposed to provide clarity and end the questions. It did the opposite. The report was clinical and direct, stating the cause of death as the acute effects of ketamine. On the surface, this seemed plausible. Perry had been undergoing ketamine infusion therapy to treat his ongoing depression and anxiety. For the media and the public, the case seemed closed, a tragic but straightforward accident involving a prescription drug. The how was answered, but buried deep within the clinical language of that same report was a single explosive detail that didn't just contradict the official narrative, it shattered it. This detail was all about timing. The medical examiner meticulously noted that while Perry was receiving ketamine therapy, his last known treatment was a full week and a half before his death. This is where the story turns from a tragedy into a genuine mystery. Medically, the half-life of ketamine is only 3 to 4 hours. This means the drug metabolizes and leaves the bloodstream very quickly. The report stated with scientific certainty that the lethally high levels of ketamine found in Perry's system, levels comparable to a patient under general anesthesia, could not possibly have been from that last infusion session. The report concluded that the fatal dose had been introduced into his system that very day through an unknown route. Traces found in his stomach suggested it might have been taken orally. This changed everything. It meant the ketamine that killed him wasn't administered by a doctor in a controlled clinical setting. It came from somewhere else, from someone else on the day he died. The official report answered what killed him, but it created a far more haunting question. Where did that ketamine come from? The science was undeniable, yet the circumstances were a complete blank. With no evidence of foul play, the police officially ruled the death an accident and closed the case. The public story ended there, leaving the most crucial question unanswered, seemingly forever. Everyone thought the mystery of Matthew Perry's final hours would be buried with him. But they were wrong. They didn't know that years before his death, in his will, Perry had already appointed the one person who could find the answer. He had named a ghost from his past as an heir, a move that would trigger a private investigation far beyond the reach of the police.
The police investigation was over, but Matthew Perry's private investigation was just beginning, and it was triggered by a ghost. Months after his death, when the initial shock had faded and the world had moved on, a legal document was quietly filed in Los Angeles court. It was his last will and testament, signed on October 26, 2009. The media and public alike braced for the inevitable explosion, the details of who would get what, the beginning of the legal battles. But the document that emerged was not a simple roadmap to his fortune. It was a masterclass in deflection, a strategic masterstroke designed for one primary purpose: privacy. Perry had used a sophisticated estate planning tool known as a pour-over will. Instead of listing his assets and beneficiaries for the world to see, the will did only one thing. It acted like a funnel. It mandated that all of his assets, valued at just over $1 million in personal property not already secured, be poured over into a pre-existing private entity. This move brilliantly pulled his entire $120 million estate out of the harsh glare of the public probate courts and into the shadows of a private trust he had established years earlier. The war everyone expected would not be fought in a public courtroom. It would be handled behind closed doors, shielded from the eyes of the world. And the name he gave this secret financial fortress was Pure Matthew Perry, a clue to its very nature as a time capsule from his past. The entity was named the Alvy Singer Living Trust. For fans of classic cinema, the reference was instantly recognizable. Alvy Singer was the neurotic, witty protagonist played by Woody Allen in the 1977 film Annie Hall, a movie Perry had adored since childhood. This wasn't just a quirky detail. It was a deliberate choice that froze a piece of his identity in time, a nod to the man he was in 2009.
The trust documents named the people he was entrusting with his entire empire: his father, John Perry, his mother, Suzanne Morrison, and his half-sister, Caitlin Morrison. This seemed like a straightforward, loving gesture to protect his family. But the document held one final name, a name that hadn't been publicly linked to Perry in over a decade. A name that made no logical sense in the context of 2023. The fourth trustee was his ex-girlfriend, Rachel Dunn. Perry and Dunn, a British fashion student at the time, had a serious relationship that ended in 2005. Yet he signed this will in 2009, a full 4 years after they had broken up. He had since been in other relationships, even getting engaged years later, but he never removed her name. Why was she still there? A ghost frozen in time within this critical legal document, given power over his vast fortune. The world saw this as a tragic, romantic gesture, a testament to a lost love so profound that she remained his most trusted confidant even years after they parted. But they were wrong. This wasn't about romance. It was about strategy. Rachel Dunn wasn't named as an heir because she was the unforgotten love of his life. She was named because she was a key witness, the only person who knew the unvarnished truth of his darkest years, when the addiction had its firmest grip. She was a witness to the life he lived off-camera, the one filled with secret meetings and shadowy figures. Her name in the will wasn't a memory, it was a weapon, waiting to be armed for a war he knew might one day come after he was gone. Rachel Dunn's name on that legal document was more than just a surprise. It was an emotional heart of a cold, strategic plan. And understanding why she was there means peeling back the layers of Matthew Perry's most private and vulnerable years. To the public, their story was a half-forgotten chapter. Their relationship, which lasted from 2003 to 2005, was seen as one of his most stable. He was the biggest television star on the planet, and she was a young, intelligent fashion student, seemingly removed from the chaos of Hollywood. Those close to Perry have said that their bond ran incredibly deep. Insiders have described Rachel as the one that got away, and even suggested that Perry deeply regretted not marrying her. By all accounts, she represented a sense of normalcy and stability that he craved, but could never fully hold on to. This is the story the world wanted to believe when her name appeared in the will, that she was the unforgettable love of his life, a woman whose impact was so profound that even years after their breakup, he still considered her family. It was a beautiful, tragic, and romantic narrative. But the timeline doesn't lie, and it tells a much darker, more complicated story. Perry signed that will in 2009. They had broken up 4 years earlier, in 2005. In the intervening years, he had moved on to other relationships. Later, he would even become engaged to someone else. Why, then, would he legally empower an ex-girlfriend from his past, giving her a seat at the table with his immediate family? Why freeze that moment in time, ignoring everything that had happened since? The answer is terrifyingly simple. Their time together, from 2003 to 2005, coincided with the absolute furnace of his addiction. It was during these years that his battle was at its most desperate and his dependency at its most severe. Rachel Dunn wasn't just his girlfriend, she was a frontline witness to his war. She saw things no one else did. She wasn't seeing the charming Chandler Bing at a red carpet event. She was seeing Matthew Perry in the throes of a life-or-death struggle, off camera, when the world wasn't watching. She would have known the network of enablers that surrounded him, the doctors, the friends, and the other shadowy figures who kept his addiction supplied. She would have known the methods, the secret transactions, and the constant, terrifying fear that defined his daily existence. She was the keeper of his darkest secrets. That is why he put her in the will. It was a calculated act of self-preservation, a move born of deep-seated paranoia. Perry's inclusion of Rachel Dunn was proof of his unwavering trust in her, but the real reason for that trust was strategic. She was the only person who knew the names and faces of the people who facilitated his addiction during its most critical phase. Her name in the will wasn't an act of love, it was an insurance policy. It was a fail-safe, designed to ensure that if anything ever happened to him under suspicious circumstances, the one person who knew the whole, ugly truth would be legally summoned to the table and have every reason to speak. With a potential key witness like Rachel Dunn now legally installed as a trustee, The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. The tabloids were salivating, and Hollywood's top lawyers were likely preparing for a years-long battle over Matthew Perry's $120 million empire. Celebrity estates are notorious for descending into chaos, tearing families apart in public, drawn-out legal wars. Everyone expected the same for the Perry estate. They were waiting for the war, but the war never came. The reason why is the single most brilliant and overlooked part of Matthew Perry's story. It lies in the legal fortress he built back in 2009, the Alvy Singer Living Trust. While the media focused on the celebrity names, they missed the legal genius of the structure itself. A last will and testament is a public document. When it enters the probate court system, it becomes a public spectacle, open for anyone to read, scrutinize, and contest. A living trust, however, is a private contract. It operates outside the courtroom, shielded from public view, its contents known only to the trustees. Perry's pour-over will was a decoy. The only public legal filing was a simple instruction to move the last remnants of his personal property, a sum just over $1 million, into this private trust. The entire bulk of his massive fortune was already in there, locked away. This move was a masterstroke. By channeling everything through the trust, Perry had single-handedly prevented the war everyone was waiting for. There would be no public fights over assets, no tabloid headlines dissecting who got what. The process was silent, efficient, and most importantly, private. But Perry's plan wasn't just about avoiding a public spectacle. It was a deeply personal act of protection.
This was his final and perhaps most meaningful act of friendship. The theme song of Friends promised, "I'll be there for you." And with this trust, Perry was making good on that promise to his family from beyond the grave. Having spent decades in Hollywood, he had a front-row seat to how fame and fortune could corrupt and destroy families. He saw how death turned loved ones into enemies fighting over money. He refused to let that be his story. The Alvy Singer Trust was a shield, designed to protect his parents and sister from the brutal glare of the media and the corrosive influence of greed. It was his way of ensuring his legacy would be a source of support for them, not a source of conflict. Everyone saw this as the perfect plan, a thoughtful and loving way to secure a peaceful future for his family. He had protected his assets, protected his loved ones, and prevented a war. The story should have ended there, but the plan wasn't just perfect, it was paranoid. And buried deep within the private trust documents was a secret clause, a poison pill known only to the 4 trustees. The clause was an explosive directive. If Matthew Perry's death was ever determined to be the result of unnatural causes, the trustees were not only empowered but legally obligated to use the funds of the trust to launch a full-scale private investigation. The plan wasn't just a shield to protect his family, it was a weapon designed to find his killer. He had hidden his own murder investigation inside his will.
The revelation of the secret clause changed everything. The Alvy Singer Trust was no longer just a shield. It was a loaded gun. And the trustees, Perry's parents, his sister, and the enigmatic Rachel Dunn, were the only ones with their fingers on the trigger. The coroner's report had been a public document, its conclusion a frustratingly simple accident. But the trustees knew the truth was buried in the report's own details. The medical examiner's finding that the fatal dose of ketamine could not have come from his prescribed therapy was the loophole they needed. It was proof enough to define his death as being from unnatural causes. The conditions of the clause had been met. The machine Perry had built years ago kicked into gear. While the world saw a family in mourning, behind the scenes, a second, darker legacy was being activated. But first, they had to honor the one he always wanted. In the weeks following his death, the world witnessed the birth of his greatest dream. The Matthew Perry Foundation was launched, a powerful and immediate fulfillment of his life's mission. Its purpose was clear and poignant: to help others struggling with the disease of addiction. It was a way to transform the immense pain that defined his life and ultimately took it into a force for healing. The foundation wasted no time, immediately securing high-profile partnerships that demonstrated its seriousness and reach. A collaboration with the NHL for a campaign called Goals for Recovery brought his cause to a massive audience. More significantly, it established the Matthew Perry Foundation Addiction Medicine Fellowship Program at the renowned Massachusetts General Hospital, a partnership that would train future doctors in the fight against the very disease he couldn't conquer. Publicly, this was the story, a beautiful legacy of hope rising from the ashes of tragedy. But while the foundation was building a legacy of hope in the spotlight, a secret legacy of justice was being built in the shadows.
Using the immense resources of the $120 million trust, the trustees did exactly what the secret clause commanded. They hired a discreet team of elite private investigators, former federal agents, and forensic accountants to do what the police couldn't or wouldn't do: find the truth. The official investigation may have been closed, but Perry's private war had just begun. This elite team operated in complete silence. They began to meticulously deconstruct Perry's final months, weeks, and days, digging far deeper than the official inquiry. They subpoenaed unredacted phone records, obtained complete financial statements, and began creating a map of his inner circle, not just his friends and family, but his doctors, his assistants, and the so-called sober companions he relied on. They were hunting for the source of the ketamine, and they believed the answer lay hidden in the transactions and conversations of his daily life. For weeks, they found nothing but dead ends, and then they hit gold. While combing through his financial records, the forensic accountants discovered something the police had missed. It was an anomaly that didn't show up on credit card statements or official bank transfers. In the week before his death, Matthew Perry had made a massive cash withdrawal from his personal account, a sum large enough to raise serious red flags. It was a completely off-the-books transaction with no paper trail to explain where it went. The money had simply vanished, and the identity of the person who received it was a complete mystery.
The discovery of the massive cash withdrawal was the first crack in the wall of silence surrounding Matthew Perry's death. It was the one piece of evidence that didn't fit the neat narrative of a tragic accident. The money itself was a ghost. Cash is untraceable by design. But its absence was a breadcrumb, and the private investigators hired by the trust began to follow the trail. They couldn't track the money itself, so they started tracking something else: the people who surrounded Perry in his isolated world. The investigation pivoted from a financial audit to a psychological deep dive into Perry's inner circle. What they uncovered was a portrait of a deeply lonely and vulnerable man, a star so desperate for connection and stability that he had built a world populated not by genuine friends, but by a constellation of paid professionals. This wasn't just about an assistant, it was about a network of sober companions, coaches, and consultants. He was paying for companionship, for a semblance of normalcy. He had walled himself off from the world in his Pacific Palisades Rome, but in doing so, he had inadvertently created an echo chamber of dependency, a circle of people whose livelihoods depended on his continued struggle. He had trusted them to help him heal, but the investigators began to suspect that some of them had a vested financial interest in keeping him sick. But tracing that suspicion to a specific person seemed impossible. The interviews were a web of half-truths and deflections. Then, the investigators realized they were missing the final piece of the puzzle: a message from the victim himself.
The team decided to go back to the one place that held the definitive answer: the scene of his death. The police had done their sweep, but they were looking for signs of a struggle, of forced entry. They weren't looking for a message hidden in plain sight. The investigators' theory was simple: if Perry knew he was in danger, If he suspected someone close to him was betraying his trust, he would have left a sign. He was a writer, a communicator. His instinct would be to leave a final word. They returned to the Pacific Palisades cottage and focused their entire attention on the jacuzzi area. They combed every inch, looking for anything out of place, anything the police might have deemed irrelevant. For hours, they found nothing. It seemed like another dead end. But then, one of the investigators noticed something odd about the jacuzzi's side service panel, a small scratch, as if it had been recently pried open and shut. Using a tool, they carefully removed the panel. Tucked away inside the machinery, protected from the water, was a small, vacuum-sealed plastic pouch. Contained within was a single, folded piece of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Matthew Perry's, shaky but clear. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a final, devastating message, an accusation. It contained just one name and a single, heartbreaking sentence. "Marcus, I thought I trusted him. Forgive me." The name sent a shockwave through the investigation. It belonged to the one person who was supposed to be his guardian angel, the man who had been by his side for years, guiding him through sobriety, the man who held the most critical role in his life, his sober coach.
The note was the smoking gun. With the name Marcus in Matthew Perry's own handwriting, the private investigators finally had the leverage they needed. The massive cash withdrawal was the motive, and the handwritten note was the accusation. Armed with this evidence, they, along with the trustee's lawyers, confronted the sober coach. The pressure was immense. Marcus knew he was trapped. His story crumbled under questioning, and he confessed. He admitted it all. He told them how Perry, in a moment of deep vulnerability and pain, had begged for a release that his doctors wouldn't provide. Marcus saw an opportunity. He exploited Perry's trust and desperation, agreeing to procure a potent, non-prescribed dose of ketamine in exchange for the large sum of cash. He had been the one who supplied the fatal dose. With his confession, the case was effectively closed. Marcus was arrested, and the news broke that the tragic accident was in fact the result of a criminal act of exploitation. Justice, it seemed, had been served. This was the final crucial step in transforming Matthew Perry's legacy. The money from his $120 million trust had done exactly what he had secretly intended. It had uncovered the truth and held the guilty party accountable. The fortune that had once been his golden cage had become the very instrument of his posthumous justice. With the investigation concluded, the trust could now fully pivot to its public mission. The Matthew Perry Foundation flourished. Fueled by the vast resources of his estate, it became a major force in the fight against addiction. The story that captured the world's attention was one of ultimate redemption. The money, once a symbol of the pain and isolation that came with fame, was now being used to save others from the same fate. Perry's greatest wish was coming true. He was being remembered not for friends, but for the lives he was changing and saving long after he was gone. His legacy was no longer about the kakahas or the wealth. It was about hope. The story was complete. A perfect, tragic, but ultimately uplifting ending. But in their final confidential report to the trustees, the investigators included one last detail from Marcus's official police interrogation. A detail so explosive it was left out of the public narrative. The report contained a transcript of Marcus's final confession made after his arrest. He admitted again to supplying the ketamine, but then he said something that changed everything. "Yes, I gave it to him," Marcus stated, according to the transcript. "I took the money, but I never told him to take a lethal dose. I wasn't even there. That was her. She was the one on the phone with him right before, telling him it was the only way to finally be free, that it would be a release from all the pain. He trusted her more than anyone. When the detectives asked who she was, Marcus gave them a name. It wasn't some unknown figure. It was the name of one of the 4 trustees of the Alvy Singer Trust. One of the people Perry had entrusted with his entire fortune and legacy. Matthew Perry hadn't been betrayed by a hired professional.
He had been manipulated into taking his own life by someone he loved, one of the heirs to his kingdom. The game wasn't over. A new, more horrifying one had just begun.
Matthew Perry's true legacy isn't just about fame or fortune. It's a complex story of struggle, justice, and the desire to help others. If this story moved you and you believe the truth behind the headlines matters, please like this video and subscribe to join us as we uncover more of these untold stories. Let us know in the comments, what part of Matthew's journey surprised you the most?